The ballroom was buzzing with applause, cameras flashing in every direction. As Bill Clinton stepped toward the podium, he flashed that trademark grin, the one that had once charmed nations, and leaned into the microphone with the casual confidence of a man who believed no stage could ever turn against him. Then, with a chuckle that sliced sharper than a blade, he let the words drop. Some folks up here think passion makes up for experience. But yelling doesn't make you wise, and makeup doesn't make you presidential. The room froze. For beat, it was as if the lights themselves dimmed, as if the chandeliers overhead held their breath. Clinton's smirk lingered as he glanced toward Jasmine Crockett, his eyes narrowing with the satisfaction of a man convinced he had landed the killing blow. Gasps rippled through the audience. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Someone in the back muttered, "Did he really just say that?" Journalists' fingers scrambled across keyboards, desperate to capture the insult, before the echo of it had even faded. The cameras zoomed in, desperate for a reaction shot. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat at the panel table, her posture steady, her gaze fixed, her silence louder than any outburst. For a moment, Clinton's words seemed to hang above her like smoke, toxic and heavy. The crowd leaned forward, anticipating the sting of humiliation. Clinton adjusted his jacket and looked out at the audience, already tasting the laughter he expected to follow. This was the stagecraft he had perfected for decades. The jab, the chuckle, the dominance. He believed the crowd was his to command. But then something shifted. It wasn't in Clinton's voice. It was in the energy of the room. A slow murmur began to grow, a restless unease. People turned their heads toward Jasmine. Eyes widened, not in pity, but in anticipation, because they had seen this look before. That quiet fire, that razor focus. It was the look of someone who had weathered storms far harsher than cheap insults. The look of a woman who carried her battles in her backbone. And in that silent pause, something became clear. Clinton had made a mistake. The crowd braced. The lights burned hotter. Every camera in the room locked onto Jasmine Crockett, but no. One in the audience was ready for Jasmine's reply. The event was never meant to be ordinary. It was billed as a marquee political summit, a gathering of power brokers, journalists, and rising voices, all under one dazzling canopy of chandeliers and velvet drapes. This was the kind of stage where reputations were made or destroyed. National networks had dispatched their cameras, knowing that the collision of generations, ideas, and egos would make for irresistible television. For Bill Clinton, this was familiar ground. He had stood on bigger stages, stared down tougher crowds, and bent public opinion with nothing more than a grin and a soundbite. He walked into the hall with the air of a man who owned the room, a veteran of political theater, who had spent decades controlling the tempo. To him, this summit wasn't a challenge, it was a playground. But for Jasmine Crockett, the weight was different. She was not expected to dominate. She wasn't the headliner, nor the star attraction. In the eyes of many in that hall, she was. A name still carving itself into the granite of history, not yet etched in stone. She carried with her the familiar burden of being underestimated, dismissed as fiery but inexperienced, passionate but not polished. To her critics, she was a figure easy to wave away. Yet that underestimation was precisely the danger Clinton failed to see. Because beneath the surface, Crockett's voice was not just hers, carried the echoes of thousands who had faced the same dismissal, the same casual arrogance. She wasn't walking onto the stage to prove her worth to the powerful seated before her. She was standing there as a reflection of the people who had already crowned her their champion. And when a crowd feels represented, the energy in the room belongs not to the veteran, but to the underdog who dares to rise. The insult Clinton had lobbed wasn't just a jab at Jasmine. To the cameras watching, to the millions who would later dissect every frame, it was a dismissal of every woman, told her passion made her weak. It was a slight against every young leader who'd been told to wait their turn, every voice accused of being too loud, too emotional, or too different. Clinton thought he had cut down one person. In truth, he had awakened a movement. The stage lights gleamed harder now, catching the tension on faces across the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably while others leaned forward with almost hungry curiosity. This was no longer just an exchange, it was theater, history in motion, clash of eras playing out under the gaze of the nation, and while Clinton basked in his illusion of control, Jasmine sat motionless. A storm coiled within calm. The silence she offered in those first moments was not weakness, it was calculation. She knew the cameras were not just waiting for her words, they were waiting for the way she would rise, the tone she would set, the truth she would unleash. Hall was thick with expectation. The seasoned figure loomed tall, convinced his dominance would hold. The underestimated underdog sat steady, her silence commanding more attention than his grin ever could. The audience expected her to shrink back. Instead, she leaned forward. Bill Clinton's rise had always been wrapped in a peculiar mix of brilliance and audacity. He was the boy from Hope, Arkansas, who had turned a Southern drawl into a national anthem, the politician whose charm could melt through scandals and whose words could bend the arc of a crowd's emotions. His life story had long been sold as an American fairy tale, proof that ambition, when paired with charisma, could carry a man all the way to the White House. And for years that charm had worked like magic. He could walk into a hostile room, tilt his head, grin, and suddenly the edge would soften. Journalists who came ready to interrogate him often left disarmed. Opponents who had sharpened their arguments found themselves stumbling mid-sentence, thrown off by his mixture of wit and disarming warmth. Clinton had mastered the art of performance, understanding that politics was less about facts than it was about feelings, less about numbers than about narrative. But charm is a currency, and like all currencies, it loses value when overused. Beneath the gloss, Clinton's career carried shadows that refused to fade. Scandals, controversies, moral compromises each, one threatened to erode his legacy. Yet time and again he slipped through, buoyed by that same confidence, that same sense that the rules of gravity simply did not apply to him. The very pattern of surviving had hardened into arrogance by the time he stepped onto that stage beside Jasmine Crockett. Clinton wasn't just a former president. He was a relic of an era where dominance meant control, where dismissing a challenger with a quip was all it took to win the night. He looked at Jasmine and didn't see a peer, didn't even see a worthy opponent. He saw an opportunity to reassert the old hierarchy, to remind the world of his wit, his power, his ability to put others in their place. That arrogance dripped from every word of his insult. He believed the audience would laugh with him, that cameras would capture his smirk and translate it into another viral clip of a seasoned veteran cutting a young politician down to size. It was the same tactic that had served him for decades. Disarm, humiliate, dominate. But what Clinton had not accounted for was the shifting tide. The America watching him now was not the America of the 1990s. The hunger for deference to political royalty had faded. The appetite for dismissive arrogance had soured. What once looked like confidence now carried the stench of entitlement. The audience didn't see a witty elder statesman. They saw a man punching down, clinging to relevance with cheap lines. And that was the danger Clinton couldn't see. He assumed his history guaranteed dominance. He assumed the weight of his name alone could tilt the room in his favor. But arrogance blinds, and on that night it blinded him to the storm that was brewing in Jasmine Crockett's silence. This was not his first insult. It's not the first time he had leaned on a cutting line to put someone in their place. But as the murmurs spread across the hall, as eyes shifted away from him and toward her, a sense of unease began to creep into the edges of the moment. This time felt different. This time, the stage was not his to command. The cameras didn't linger on Clinton's smirk, they lingered on Jasmine's stillness. Audience wasn't laughing, they were waiting. For the first time in a long time, Clinton was no longer dictating the tempo. He had thrown the punch. Yes, but the silence that followed was heavier than his words. And somewhere, perhaps deep within his own instincts, he must have felt it, the slow turning of the tide.